Great, thank you for that introduction. I'm going to talk today, actually, so you want me to do 25 minutes, and then, or half an hour, because I noticed that the schedule there was a bit different.
Yeah, that's fine. Speak at
20, okay, fine. So I'll probably speak for about 15, 20 minutes, and then I have a couple of clips from some films, very short, and then, more importantly, I just want to do a Q&A at the end where we can actually have some questions and answer the discussion. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here, and thanks to all you guys for showing up here. I'd like to talk about a few things today. I want to talk about media in general, and why I got involved in media, in filmmaking and photography first. And then I'd also like to talk about why I think media can be very powerful in terms of social justice, human rights issues. And also to see why people get involved, how media can be used as a tool. And all of this, of course, related to my passion, which is filmmaking. So ultimately, it's all about, in fact, why I got involved in filmmaking in the first place, and hopefully that's going to open up a discussion on the values of filmmaking, on ways that, in fact, any job can be considered very socially constructive, no matter what that job is. So I'd like to get an idea first from you guys about, let's say, the media landscape in general, if we're talking about news media and documentary filmmaking. What are your immediate thoughts when you think about news? For example, do you trust news media, international broadcasters, or large networks? Do you think they represent you, your voice? Do you think there's a broad range of views that they represent? So can someone just yell out some thoughts? Do you trust the news, I would say, at the start, in general? Yeah?
At least in the States, it's very, not okay to trust the news because we've got, the two parties, and each news source will be with one party or with the other, at least to some extent. So
okay. It's very similar here. You have left-wing news, you have right-wing news. Yeah?
I think for most issues, I trust the mainstream sources, but for some things, it's worth digging a lot deeper. So if you're looking at, especially looking at issues such as Palestine,
okay.
I wouldn't go to mainstream sources necessarily.
Okay, interesting. And why is that?
Because a lot of, I don't always agree with sort of generally held opinions, and a lot of that bias is carried over in reports like that, where issues are a bit more, maybe not, they're quite contentious, but also there's what's considered as quite a widely held opinion, then that sort of carries through.
Yeah, it becomes dominant.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other thoughts? Views? Everyone else is fine, they trust it, 100%?
It always personally worries me a little bit that the news likes to focus on the bad news in the world when there's so many good things happening out there, but we're always hearing about murders and wars, and I think it's a real shame that the focus seems to be on these as opposed to the good things that are happening, the advances in technology that we're enjoying today, longer lives, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a very good point as well. So not only their views on a particular subject, but even the subject in general that they choose to do. Yeah, great. Other thoughts?
I believe news focuses on what people want to hear. One of my best friends, she's from Syria, and another is from Somalia. When I asked them, is it true what the news is showing us? And when I heard their stories, it is very different from everything the news presenters tell you. So I believe they only show what we want to hear, probably.
Yeah, there's a lot, and there's a lot of reasons for that, right? So partly commercial news, it really is delivering the product that people have to pay for, or advertising money pays for. So yes, then they really do have to give people what they want to see. But even with public broadcasters, you can't just tell someone, well, this is important, so watch it and be interested, because if they're not interested, they won't watch it, and then your network suffers. So there's a lot of reasons for it, but you do find, well, there was an interesting survey done about probably 2 or 3 years ago, where they asked the British public what are the top professions that you mistrust? And the top 3 were bankers, obviously, politicians, and then journalists. So it's pretty dire in the sense of you know, the amount of trust that people have, the amount of faith that people have in media. And what you find very often, yes, in one sense they're giving you what they think you want to hear, let's say, and they have to operate in a commercial atmosphere. But then you can also see a lot of much more subtle biases in the news that I also find really fascinating. For example, you know, when you watch the financial news, they might tell you what stocks are doing well or how you can invest your money. They won't tell you about a change in benefits laws or a better way that you can use public services. So who's the audience they're talking to? Very obviously not necessarily all of us, or people who are on benefits, or people who don't have money to invest in stocks and shares. So even their sort of demographic is very different, doesn't necessarily represent the class structure in Britain. So there are a lot of things in news media that I think we should be worried about, concerned about. And that's kind of where this story begins, is that I was looking at mainstream news media, partly because of my own background. I'm Palestinian, so my world is very often the news. I was noticing it didn't necessarily represent the society we're living in, like Britain, but also it wasn't really talking about the things that I thought was interesting: human rights, social justice. I'm not one of these people that thinks that the media is evil and we should dismiss it and we have to have a revolution and restructure it. I think there are issues with it, but I think that we can improve it. And so my initial goal was how can I improve that landscape so that information that I think is important is getting out. But at the same time, I didn't know exactly what role I would be able to play, how I would do that. And it made me think about my sort of obsession with film. So ever since I was young, as long as I can remember, I had been obsessed with films and watching films, but also how films are made, the idea of making films. And my sister, anyway, when she graduated university, she became a journalist. So this idea of journalism and working with media was suddenly present every day in my life. And it seemed like something that was very interesting to me. At the same time, I have, probably like a lot of you, I have a background as an activist. So when I was at university, I was an activist. You know, I was involved in protests, I was a campaigner. And I wanted to find a way to connect those two worlds, but in a way that I found constructive. So I wanted to do it in a way that I thought would sort of fit my set of skills. I didn't really want to be, I considered for a while, for example, being a politician, but that didn't appeal to me in the long run. I considered being more of a campaigner or an activist, but then I guess I got a bit cynical about that world, or somehow I didn't really fit into that world. And that eventually led me, sports with my sister's influence, to making documentary films. So why do I actually make films? It's because I wanted to somehow constructively change that landscape of media. Because I realized that media is, of course, very influential. Sociologically, we can look at that. But it's also very exciting, the idea of making a film, of going, of traveling somewhere where you would not normally go, the idea of meeting people that you wouldn't normally meet. So that's something that's really compelling to me in journalism, is that it gives you an excuse to be curious, and it gives you an excuse to go places where most people wouldn't go, and to somehow explore, to ask a lot of these questions that maybe a lot of people are thinking, but they don't actually ask, because they don't necessarily have a reason to. And I also like the idea of being able to influence the media landscape, being able to change it, and in some small way, at least, try and get the representation that I thought was more accurate. So, because I'm Palestinian, there's a lot of news, a lot of documentaries are made about Palestine, but most of them in general, I don't feel represent the reality, like you were saying about your friends in Syria and Somalia. So, they're often very biased or maybe racist. or very simplistic, or more often than not, the journalist takes on the responsibility to speak for other people. Right? And that's kind of a fundamental issue with journalism, that if you trust the journalist, you're essentially trusting them to speak on behalf of their subjects, the people in their films. I didn't like that so much, so I wanted to try and develop a new way of filmmaking that's more participatory, in a sense. So it's more of a collaboration between me and the people in the film, that instead of me representing them, we are working together to represent their story, giving them more of a chance to represent themselves and to tell their narrative, rather than me just trying to fit them into something I already had assumed, which sometimes is the case in news, that kind of thing. But then we have this real clash, in a way, of my ideals, because I wanted to do my background in campaigning, which can be very directly related to issues, but I had this passion for filmmaking. Is it important? That's a question that I find very difficult to answer even now. Is it something very frivolous? If you're making a film, it costs quite a lot of money, you're using up a lot of resources, you are becoming involved in people's lives, people who are sometimes very vulnerable. Is it constructive? So I really do think, like I said in the beginning, that any job, any profession can be socially constructive. Even the ones that we think are horrible and exploitative and divisive. Very often you do hear stories about people from a background you wouldn't expect, someone who's in business, for example, and they do something that is actually very constructive. Somehow they are brave enough or strong enough to break out of their system a little and do something that is much more constructive than what the job needs to be. Right. So while most people would be happy to define success in a very traditional way, maybe not finance, maybe money, maybe family, maybe your job description, whatever it might be, whatever good business card. But then occasionally there are those who want to define it in a different way, to say, well, I can use this profession to do something socially constructive. So that's what I wanted to do with film, is turn it into a tool, so it's not just, I'm not just an artist who makes things for my own benefit, or to become famous, or to make money, but that this tool can actually be shared with the people in the film. So in a sense, I feel like there's a collaboration between us to somehow shift people's perspective, even if it's in a very, very small way. But you do it in a small way by telling stories. So I don't feel that you do it in a way, you don't just want to convey information. So I don't make films in the traditional way with a script and a plot and an idea that may be predefined and you need to find people to fill in the gaps. But in fact, you're taking people on a journey, so it's a much more humanistic approach. So I'm interested in not saying Syria, I need to make a film about Syria. So let me find someone in Syria to illustrate the story. In fact, I want people to be able to watch my films and not even necessarily know where these people are or where they're from. Because the differences are not so exciting to me. What I think a lot of mainstream journalism or documentary film does is it really wants to exploit the differences. It wants you to be interested in that story because there's something different about it, or strange about it, or there's a novelty about someone's life. But isn't it much more interesting to be able to relate to someone as another human being and only then realize what might be extraordinary about their life? They live in a war zone, or they are a soldier, or they live under occupation, or they are the occupier. Who knows? But you learn something new about them, and hopefully it's surprising because you've been following them as a human. You haven't been following them as a statistic or as a subject of the film. Make sense so far? So in that sense, as a Palestinian, of course, the, let's say, mythology of the fighter is very powerful in Palestinian society. I was never really someone who was attracted to that way of life. But, you know, sometimes I do think, sure, under different circumstances, maybe I would have been a fighter with a weapon. But in another sense, I am fighting. But the camera is a weapon, so filmmaking is a weapon. And you can say that metaphorically, but in some way it's true. In some ways it is literally a weapon, because I do feel like we can confront very serious powers with filmmaking. So journalism, documentary filmmaking, it in a sense gives you the right to question a lot of things that we don't normally question. It gives you also the responsibility to challenge power structure. So there's something very fulfilling about an ordinary person like myself with a camera being able to confront a very powerful politician and say, well, what about this? Right? You claim that you respect the rights of all minorities, but this is some evidence of a massacre that took place in Iraq, for example. You claim that benefit cuts aren't going to harm the poor, but here's evidence that they will. So it is a weapon in a way that we can wield it to try and challenge, like you were saying, the mainstream story, right? So the assumptions. When people say, oh, sure, well, the government says that if we increase the banking sector, then the economy is going to improve, of course. But sometimes you go, well, hang on a minute, what about these people? Or what about these people? Those are the minority stories that we have the ability, and I think the responsibility to try and follow. So that's what filmmaking, or this style of filmmaking, allows us to do, is to challenge that and also provide evidence for it. But we need to do it in a way that's humanistic. We need to do it in a way that people will be interested, people will follow the story, people will relate to the story. I was telling you, Romana, earlier, what's the difference between information and a good documentary, creative use of filmmaking? I always tell students, because I teach filmmaking as well, documentary filmmaking, if you want to convey information, write a report. You don't need to make a film. I don't think film, in fact, is a very good way of just conveying information. It's a fantastic way of telling a story and of capturing someone's imagination if you do it well. If you just need a lot of information, then you can print it online, right? You don't need to make a film. So how do you approach it? Because it's the thing that's very intimidating about filmmaking. It's easy for me to tell everyone, great, grab a camera and go out and make a film and be empowered. But how do you do it? It's one of these industries that seems almost too unwieldy, right? People very often, it seems like you need a lot of money, you need a lot of experience. I didn't study film, first of all. I did go to university, but my degree wasn't really directly related to filmmaking. It was just something I was very passionate about. And I actually, first of all, I just watched a lot of films. And I analyzed the way that they were made. So I read a lot about films and filmmaking and directors that I admire. And then eventually I just had to start doing it. So I started with stills photography, and I have been doing that since I was about 14 years old, probably. So that started to develop a visual style. And then in university I got some friends together and we made a filmmaking club. So we got some funding from the university to start shooting films. So we wrote the script, we produced it, we shot it, we edited it. Of course they weren't very good, but the point is that you learn how to make films, you learn the craft. Then in 2004 I shot my first documentary. And again, I didn't know what I was doing, but it was just a way of experimenting. It was a way of seeing what worked, what didn't work in front of the camera. And then, most importantly, it was a way of figuring out what my voice was, what my sort of filmmaking style was. Because if you want to make films in this way, there's no point in just reproducing the films that everyone else is making, because then you make the same mistake. They'll still be superficial, they'll still be prejudiced, there'll still be the obvious stories to tell. So you need to make another story, but people are going to be interested in the film because of you and your style and the style of how you relate to the people in your film. You know, the ethics of how you treat the people in your film is very important to me. And if I relate to the people in my film as human beings, not just as subjects, then hopefully the film reflects that, and it's more real because of it, it's more interesting because of it. You don't need to go halfway across the world to make a film in a war zone. So a lot of the work that I do is in the Arab world, but that's really just because of my background and my language and where my family lives and where I grew up. But some of the best documentary films are made about people, what's going on in their backyard, what's going on in the street in front of them. As long as it's something that's important to you, that you're passionate about. Because filmmaking is very slow and can be a really boring process, but if you're going to commit to it, obviously it needs to be something that you really care about. But you can find those stories anywhere. You can find them. They can also be very personal stories, right? About you, yourself, about your family, about your background. But the important thing is that you want to tell it in a different way, in a new way that hasn't been done before. Or at least in a new way that people can identify, okay, that's your voice, that's why I'm interested in your film. Because you have a distinctive character in your film. I guess most importantly in this sort of how-to is that you don't need to go to film school, especially now, because that technology is much more accessible. I don't think film school is a terrible thing. I mean, there are a lot of filmmakers who just dismiss it. I think for some people it works very well. If you feel like you need it, if you feel like you want to learn in a more structured environment. But to become really good at filmmaking, you have to just do it repeatedly. It's like a musical instrument, you have to practice. And you have to learn from your mistakes. And the great thing about filmmaking now with something like that camera is you can see a mistake immediately. So you can make a 3-minute film about something, and immediately you'll know what worked and what didn't. And at the same time, you're developing your style, your way of interacting. Above all, I think it's always crucial to remember what those films have the power to do. So they have this incredible ability to challenge mainstream assumptions, to challenge structures of power that we may not agree with, to challenge things like political rhetoric, to challenge things like exploitation, to highlight human rights abuses. So whatever we think is interesting in our own lives or important in our own lives, it has that ability to draw those stories out. And it also makes you, in a sense, it gives you a responsibility to also challenge those assumptions and then to convey that information to other people. But none of that is worth anything if it's not good storytelling. That's the most interesting thing to me, or the most exciting thing, is how do you do all of this, the technical side, the political side, the ethical side, the moral side, and still ultimately make a good film. Because if you're not making good films, then you shouldn't be filmmaking. You don't want to make good films. Is that clear? Okay. Shall I show you? Let me show you a very brief clip. I mean, it's something like 90 seconds long. So, can we turn, actually, can we dim the lights a bit? I don't know if that works. Thank you. I make films most often about people and groups that are not generally represented in the media. So this one I made in 2007 about conscientious objectors from the US military. So people who joined the military willingly and went to war and then realized they were against war. They were either they refused to be involved, or they thought that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were immoral. So they wanted to become recognized as conscientious objectors. It's a very strange movement, it's very small, but it does represent the beginnings of this kind of resistance in war. And we found it fascinating because of the sort of more ambiguity.
I would say one of the moments where I met a crystallization of conscience We were flying over the Arabian Gulf doing reconnaissance, tracking an Iranian submarine, and I heard over the radio set an Iranian voice saying, "Coalition aircraft maintain 5 nautical miles." And as we kept making passes over this submarine, the voice got more nervous, more nervous, more nervous. During this time, I was reading Thich Nhat Hanh, his theory of nonviolence. I was getting back into the Bible, you know, thinking about the teachings of Jesus, treating everyone as your brother. And I started to realize that this man, this human being in this submarine, Iranian or not, he was a human being. And that he could have a family, maybe he doesn't, but he was just a human being like me, he was my brother. And the nervousness in his voice really set me off, and I don't think I flew another mission after that. It was the next mission that I had told my, my instructor that I was a conscientious objector, even though I didn't really know what that entailed at the time.
So these are the kind of stories that really interest me, is ones that surprise you, that maybe shock you, but somehow ultimately they reveal something new about a subject that's already very familiar. Are there any questions there? Any criticisms, ideas? Yes.
Have you ever filmed anything that involves like war, like you being there witnessing, say, any battles or like outbreaks, or are there any risks involved in this process?
Yes, yeah. I mean, there doesn't have to be, you know, but you can make documentaries that are not about war. But I do make films also in conflict zones. I can show, you know, I'd be happy to show you more material later when we have time. But yeah, it can be dangerous, but it's always a choice, right? I'm not because I'm not an employee of a news organization. There's no pressure to go to these places, and I'm not attracted to them because of the war. So I'll go there if I think I can do something. Yeah. Yeah.
How do you get access to go into like interview or all of these things? Because some of them are quite strict, and you're going as your personal, or you're just using your company name to get access to like interview or form whatever they're doing.
I go as an individual, usually a very small team, but it takes time. I mean, that's, you know, the development of a film can be a year, 2, 3 years, because that's the time that you're taking to gain people's trust, also to make sure that they understand what they're getting involved in if they take part in this documentary. But it's through contact, and it's through people that you meet, and it's through friends and family. So you need to find interesting, original, or safe ways of getting access to something, and developing that relationship to the point where you think it can work. But I mean, this film, for example, I met someone who works with these conscientious objectors, and then 3 years later I made this film. So I met him, and then different stuff happened, I forgot about him, we made other films, and then something came up and I thought, oh wait a minute, this guy works with conscientious objectors, that could be a really interesting story. So I got in touch with him again, and then it started. So often it's someone you meet years ago and you don't really remember that meeting until you're about to make a film. Sorry. It can be luck. Yeah.
Sorry, you're answering that. Sorry.
No, it's fine. I'm done.
As a passion and as something, as a good career, I mean, it sounds brilliant. How's it commercially, and to make as a career choice for the end people? How's it commercially viable, and how does it give the returns?
Yeah, it's very difficult, I won't lie, it's very difficult. I mean, there's an easier way of doing it, which is that you make documentaries that are more commercial. And there's a very difficult way, which is that you make the sort of films I make, which, this one is fairly commercial. We made it for Al Jazeera English, so it was commissioned by a broadcaster. But most of the films I make are not like that. So it takes a lot of persistence. But I can give you a very quick overview of how I would fund a film if you wanted to start from zero. You have an idea, you find a grant that matches that idea. So it could be the South London Benevolent Fund for Caribbean Communities. And film, and they say, sounds great, here's £500. And then in return you show the film in our community centre when it's done. with that £500, you shoot some footage, then you go to a local broadcaster and you say, hey look, I shot some of this footage, this is the film, the South London Caribbean Benevolent Fund is behind me, are you interested? And they say, oh great, here's £5,000 in return for the right to broadcast this film for 1 year. Then you take your £500, you shoot some more material, you edit a short film, you go to a bigger broadcaster and you say, here's a 5-minute version, would you like a 30-minute version? And they say yes, and you go, great, it'll cost £35,000. And they say, here's £35,000. That's a very condensed way of how it works. It usually takes place over 3 years, and 99% of the people say no, but that's how it works. And there's also, you know, every film festival usually has a pitching session where it's like Dragon's Den, 10 people who have money, broadcasters, funders, and then you present your film, and then at the end they say, sounds great, let's talk, or not interested. So that's another, you know, much more traditional way of funding film. So it requires a lot of patience and perseverance and other people around you. It's not something I would recommend doing on your own. Right? You need people who are supportive, other filmmakers who believe in the project as well. And then there's things like Kickstarter. I mean, I'd be happy to talk more about the real practicalities of it. Yeah, it's possible. Yeah.
Firstly, as an Arab myself, I find it really inspiring. But my question is, what is the most powerful story you've sort of told in a film?
For me, you mean? Yeah. Wow, I don't know. The most powerful, you mean in terms of what I was most affected by? It was a film on Syria that we did also for Al Jazeera just last year. It was the most disturbing because, you know, there's a type of violence there that's quite rare, which is really not just for war, but it's a very malicious kind of personal violence. So we were meeting a lot of people who've been tortured. But I think what disturbed me the most was that we met a lot of refugees who were fighters and had been imprisoned and tortured. So they would go into another country to get treated, and all they wanted to do was go back and continue fighting. So, and it was almost inconceivable to me that they would go through this kind of pain and then want to go back, knowing essentially that they either die or the revolution succeeds. So it was very disturbing because of the descriptions, but also the idea that they had nothing, really nothing left to live for, except to be fighting. So it was a kind of desperation, or you know, extreme loss of faith that I haven't really seen before. That for me was the most disturbing. Yeah, but I don't know if that's your question. Most powerful. I mean, this is probably the most challenging one. You know, it challenged the US military, it challenged my own prejudices about soldiers, it challenged British military, it challenged the people in the film. So. Other questions? I don't want to run too far over time, but I'll talk faster.
You know that most of the documentary, is it like a long duration or just a short one? Is it like 10 minutes or an hour documentary? Because most of your documentaries, is it like...
Now they're feature length more than shorter ones. But I also still do half hour for TV, not so much anymore. But now they tend to be an hour to 90 minutes.
Where can we gain access to your films? On TV or
the two, yeah, I mean, because of everything I've been telling you, my films don't sell very well on British television. But they sell very well in Scandinavian television. They like very slow, complicated films. So if you live in Scandinavia, but the two that I just finished will be screening in London, hopefully late summer, July, August. So you can go to my website, or just give me your email address and I can tell you when it will screen. But those are most likely in the UK to be shown in festivals or art house cinemas rather than on TV. Yeah. Any other questions? comments? Concerns? Okay, I'll be here for a bit longer. If you do have any more questions, please let me know. Great, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for Saeed's inspirational insight into filmmaking. And I think just to reiterate very quickly about the persistence that he has, the passion that he has towards telling people's story, as drove him to where he is today. Can we give another round of applause to Saeed? Now, with much pleasure, I would like to invite Shailesh Patel. He's the founder of Healthy Planet, a social enterprise that strives to make a difference globally and locally to the health and welfare of the planet and its people. So without further ado, I'll let Shailesh introduce himself further. Thank you.
You guys hear me okay? Yeah. I talk quite loud, so